Good morning, I'm Chris Curtis, Editor-in-Chief of Broadcast, and we're kicking off the Restart Conference in conversation with two of the UK's most powerful TV executives. Jane Turton has been Chief Executive of All 3 Media for 6 years, while Alex Mahon is closing in on 4 years as the boss of Channel 4. The companies they run are very well established, a super indie powerhouse and a public service broadcaster, but the rate of disruption in the industry has only been exacerbated by the unprecedented COVID pandemic. So this morning, we'll be discussing what has changed for good and what might bounce back to the pre-pandemic world. We'll cover the implications of the streaming revolution for broadcasters and producers, the balance of power between those two sectors, and how TV can ensure that its working culture is fit for purpose. Welcome, Alex and Jane. So guys, thank you for joining us. It's common consensus now that the world has been changed by the pandemic, and we want to investigate a little bit about how and why and what's going to pop back to the way things were and what's going to perhaps stay the same. So can I ask you both, Alex, I'll come to you first of all. How do you think the last 15 months has changed Channel 4? What do you think coming out of it the organisation has learned to do differently? What changes might stay with the organisation?
Well, we've all learned how to do calls whilst wearing a proper top, but jogging bottoms on the bottom, haven't we? I'm sure that skill will remain with me. I think we've probably come forward about a decade in terms of agile working, and we all did that in a snap overnight. So that's meant massive technology shifts, you know all this, it's meant massive shifts to how people are working. Perhaps the more interesting things are what will remain with us. So I think for us, we all have learned how to manage people better. So we've moved from managing people by just checking they're at their desk to how do you actually set objectives, how do you check in with people, how do you become more active. That's probably a big piece of progress we needed to make in television anyway. I think we've moved to knowing that people are always working wherever they are. It's not about presenteeism. That's a good thing. Channel 4 has been more accessible. So there's been this kind of geo-leveling effect of being able to get meetings, to have meetings, not to have to travel to us. Meetings starting on time, finishing on time, and definitely in our recent survey, we've found we've become faster and more accessible because of that. And those are things we've needed to change for a long time.
Accessible to, is that about out of London producers you're talking about, or are you talking more widely? Do you think you're more accessible to indies that are based in London than Leeds, for example?
So it's been particularly pronounced with out of London indies. So it's been particularly pronounced because people have felt that there's not some special club in London. Now, we were going that way anyway. We've got 250 people now outside of London, right? Leeds is a big office, Glasgow, Bristol, Manchester. But it's also about, for everyone, our teams respecting meeting times. You know, I think the sort of Zoom culture changed us all to respect meetings starting on time, finishing on time, and being a bit more disciplined in that. So that's helped, getting things in the diary faster.
Good. Jane, I'll come to you then. Is that something that, as a leader of a massive production group, you'd recognise? Are your labels reporting back and saying, whether it's commissioners at Channel 4 or any other organisation, are more readily accessible?
Yeah, I think so. And globally, clearly, it's easier to, you don't have to get on a flight and land at LAX and go to a hotel and then pitch up in someone's office. So there are some positive things. I mean, I think some of the things Alex has mentioned, I think we've learned to be a bit more compassionate. I hope we have. I hope that's permanent as well. I mean, I think we've learned, we've seen people's lives on screens, haven't we? We've seen their puppies and children and their, partners come in and out of the room. And we've sort of got much more of a sense of what's going on behind the scenes, as it were, which I hope has made us a bit more understanding. Mm-hmm. So I think there are some positive things. I think there's some negative things as well. I question some of the productivity, the statements people make about productivity. I think we are productive, but are we more productive? I'm not sure. Yeah. And I think some of it's more difficult. There's no doubt that we've probably made the odd mistake where if we'd been in a room, someone would have picked up on something. Yeah. But, 15 iterations of a deck that's whizzing backwards and forwards in PowerPoint and you just miss it. So I think it's a mixed bag. I think the real question is what next? I mean, we don't really yet know quite what it looks like in the future. We're trying to work that out and doing it with people rather than just sort of mandating.
Well, I think that what are you coming to an office for?
Yeah.
So if now I like to say if Amazon taught us we didn't need to go to the shops, this has taught us we don't need to go to the office to do work, but therefore what are you coming together for? So is that for creativity? Is it for collaboration? Is it for concentration? You know, and different people in different roles are going to use the office differently, and that will all need to be reconfigured.
I think that's exactly right. And I think, yeah, I mean, so look, the sort of boring rules about how many days a week is really tiny. That's a tiny part of it. It's much more, you're right, about the why and the cultural bits of it and the social bits of it and all of that stuff that we've just missed. We're a bit scratchy some of the time as well, if I'm being completely honest. You know, there's a bit of sort of like, oh, bloody hell, why haven't we done that? That bit we didn't have before. I think that's just pressure. There's more pressure in some respects.
Well, I think if you're at home and you get annoyed by someone in a meeting, not that ever happens to me, there's nowhere to discharge. So you can't do the thing you would go in the office, make up a tea and kind of sound off to someone for 2 minutes, or just change the topic of conversation. So people are left with that anger at home. And as a manager, you often have to spot that and discharge it in a different way.
Yeah.
And you don't have that when you're together with people, because you can have a disagreement or have a different point of view.
Or even say, let's go out for a glass of wine and clear the air.
Or have a debate in a meeting.
Yeah. It's definitely changed the tenure, the tone of things, isn't it? In the same way that it's easy to get the tone wrong of an email, for example, when you're doing a Zoom meeting.
I think it's heightened. I think that's right. I think it's heightened those sort of interactions in a way which I think I hadn't entirely predicted.
And let's talk about creativity, because, Jane, your company, you've got loads of development teams up and down the country trying to be inventive and clever and creative in that way. How has being disparate affected development teams, do you think?
So I think the word is team, I think, is part of the answer to it. So I think when you're working with people remotely, it is definitely different from being in the same room around one table. And I don't actually know that it's any different for us than it would be for Alex and her team. I'm not even sure it's any different in a commercial environment than a creative environment. I just think if you're doing something that is team, and television is a team, it's a team endeavour, I think it is more difficult to do it when you're not sitting around a table. But we've been remarkable. We've actually achieved an extraordinary amount. We've continued to develop. We spent a lot more time doing it, which again has helped to compensate. I think we've been successful. We've pitched, we've sold, we've produced, give or take. You know, there's been hiatus, but we got through that. We've maintained the relationships with people like, Alex and her team successfully. So, pretty resourceful ultimately, given the strictures, but not as easy and certainly different.
And do you expect that to sort of be like a rubber band and sort of come back? Do you think that development, once people are back in the office, will sort of go back to the way it was? Or do you think that there is a sort of hybrid version?
I think, to Alex's point, I think it will be different. It will be more hybrid, but I still think that people will choose to do, well, they'll certainly choose to do more together in the same physical space than they have been able to do, but not perhaps back to pre-COVID.
Yeah. And Alex, do you think that clearly we've spoken to a lot of indies who are out of London indies, delighted with the fact that they are on a level playing field as they talk about it now. Do you think that there'll become a hierarchy, though, in the sense that we are going to go back to a world in which people go out for lunch, and that perhaps the currency, the value of a 30-minute Zoom meeting isn't quite the same as a face-to-face get-together, which might move into something else as the day goes on? Do you see what I mean?
Well, I hope we are going to have a world where people can go out for lunch. I'm really hoping that comes back. That seems a fundamental part of the industry. But I think we need a balance of those, right? There are some benefits of not having to travel to go to meetings and discipline around that. And for some people, actually, the pitching in that Zoom environment, single frame, everyone the same size, is a benefit, right? So we have to take the benefits of that. There are then conversations or bits of work that happen better at home. Like if you have to screen something or if you have to read a script, for a lot of people, that's way better at home. No one can interrupt them. Don't have to manage anyone. No one's bothering you with questions. There are then things which might be co-creating or talking about difficult things which have to be done in person. So I just think we need that mix going forward. But obviously what we need to create is genuine access to the industry, regardless of where you are from and where you live. And I think we've already seen major changes in that. And we're also seeing a lot of people moving out of London now, right? The desire to maybe go somewhere else and live somewhere else has come now. So we've got to have a mix, a blend of those.
Do you think it could accelerate? I mean, one of Channel 4's key, arguably the key strategic objective of C4 over the last 18 months, 2 years, has been the move out of London, the establishing of the bases around the UK. Do you think this could accelerate that? Could make those bases more powerful more quickly?
Well, I think we've got two objectives, right? Digital and being representative of the UK. They come together. We've already got 250 people outside of London. I think we've done that really fast. Right? It was only about 2 years ago that we picked where we'd go. But I think we'll see more of people choosing where their home office is or where their designated office is. That's what I think we'll see, and we'll have to be more flexible to make that work for staff.
And I'm going to ask you both now about something I didn't think I'd ask you about if we were doing this interview a year ago, property portfolios.
That's exciting.
Well, so there's always been speculation in recent times about Horsefree Road. If anything, you'd say this pandemic means the need to have a vast office in Westminster is reduced further. It's got to be something that's on your agenda to look at and to think about the Channel 4 property portfolio.
I mean, I think what we've done is like the Majestic, which is our big building in Leeds, is opening in the next few months. And what we're doing there is we've massively reduced the desk ratio, and we've got lots of agile working spaces, and we're switching the organisation to 50-50, right? 50% of work from home, 50% in an office. That starts as soon as we can properly come back. And then we're going to see. Like, I don't want to make any decisions too fast on that. Because what we've seen in surveys is people didn't want to come to the office, then they really wanted to come. Now they kind of want to come. I've got no sort of line of what's the predictable going to be. I think as soon as you know what the predictable is, then you look at everything and go, how do we all want to work?
We can go from there. And Jane, for you, I mean, All Three has many indie labels across the UK, across the world. And it's always been the case that for All Three, the signature has been the federal structure. You know, it's not like some of your peers and rivals where the indies are all based in the same building. I wonder whether you are looking at it strategically and thinking, do all my labels need to have independent offices? Are we potentially moving something where you can still maintain that sense of individuality for your labels, but potentially with a shared
well, look, I mean, as you'd expect, consistent, I guess, with the federal model, we allow that sort of decision to be made locally, which I think is the right way to do it. As far as the sort of HQ is concerned, we're probably going to go 3 out of 5 days, something like that. But again, like Alex has said, we're going to do it as a sort of phased approach, because I don't know that we know yet quite how people will respond. We certainly don't know yet exactly where the COVID of it's going in the short to medium term. So we're trying to be flexible. We will be flexible, and we'll certainly consult with people as we go. We're not mandating is the answer. And again, it sounds very similar to Channel 4. I think it's sort of sampling it as you go.
Yeah.
As far as the opcos are concerned, I think they'll do exactly the same. Some will have to have people back in, and some won't. And some will choose a mixed economy, and some will have it one way or the other. I mean, it will be very much individual, case by case.
Very good. Let's talk about content and how the pandemic potentially has changed appetites or not, as the case may be. It became clear during the last 15 months that there was a surge of interest and there's a requirement to create lockdown content, celebrities at home filmed on their phones, that kind of thing. It felt like the appetite for that kind of content was quite intense and then waned relatively quickly. What, if anything, have you guys learned respectively about appetites for content? Is there going to be polarization potentially between super premium content and lower tariff, quicker to produce, easier to produce content? Jen, I'm going to come to you first on that.
No, we don't see it like that. I mean, we don't sit there saying, let's develop a super premium idea and a not so super premium idea. No, I don't recognise that language. I think, nor is it the case, is it? We've learnt that it just because it's high budget, it's popular or wins awards. In fact, if you look at some of the stuff we're making in the digital space, that's very low budget relative to television content, incredibly popular. Equally, you still have to look at those big soaps and the business they do every day of the week and compare them to the Queen's Gambit and think they are very popular and they don't cost the same as the Queen's Gambit or the Crown. So I think the sort of budget point that people make, I think is not the relevant point. I think what we have learnt is the blurring of edges around some of these genres, some of these old definitions has become more obvious, as in they've become more blurred. We're doing a lot more, of the sort of drama doc, the hybrid, a lot more feature doc, a lot more of the sort of reality that gets into scripted reality. Some of these boundaries that were there before are no longer there. So I think that's the thing. And I think people are, maybe it's because they've had more time to develop during COVID, but people are testing and experimenting more in some of the development areas, which I think is quite exciting. But still, Chris, it's popular content. That's what we all want to make. That's what Alex wants to buy. I don't think you sit there and say, let's go super premium
Don't go,
on
let's
Wednesday.
have unpopular content.
No,
Pretty
exactly.
Sure no one asked for that.
Correct.
But Channel 4 did in the last 15 months order cheaper content for perfectly obvious, perfectly understandable reasons. Some of that resonated really well, was successful. And I also wonder whether in some ways the move to digital, where you're not commissioning first and foremost through the prism of a linear schedule, where there was always a temptation to say, we need a show, it needs to play on Tuesdays at 8 p.m, it can't cost more than, or it needs to cost between 100 and 150k an episode. With that move as well, and with what we've learned over the last, is there a blurring of the lines, do you think, around the way that the old structures of tariff and slot and may come to pass?
So I think if you look back at what happened at the start of the pandemic, we did a thing that was quite unusual. So we went, obviously we had to reduce money in the content budget because the revenues were down, but then we said, let's put money back into reactive content. And the reason we ended up, growing linear share last year by 7% and streaming was up 26%, which is, really incredible numbers for us, was because we were more reactive to what was going on in the country. So doing lots of those shows, people cooking at home, people crafting at home, people making art at home, people cleaning their homes, people
and
avoiding
it was new
getting
and original.
It was new and it was fresh.
Yeah.
Sometimes it was very cheap. But mainly it was reactive to what consumers were actually going through. So for us, that was a bit more putting viewers at the heart of what we were doing, thinking about the audience more directly connected, making decisions faster, working more closely with indies, often in very tight and difficult circumstances for the indies, right? So there was some learning in there about reacting to the audience, trialing things that are tricky because they're cheap or making them fresh, but being reactive and that's what we saw us taking popularity for, right? So that's a good lesson. Now, if you look at what audiences want, they don't want any more content about the pandemic, right? We had this whole kind of Q1, which was joy in a joyless age, put on warm things, bake-off things, positive things, things that make people feel like they're in a warm bath in the middle of John Lewis, right? That's how we all felt we needed to be. Now, when we do surveys with audiences, they don't want stuff that makes them anxious. They don't want stuff that's too challenging. They want stuff that makes them feel warm about the world. They want the stuff that makes them feel positive about the future. They want stuff that connects them back to nature, and they want to be more invested in their own futures. So there's some really practical stuff like how to save £1,000 in 24 hours. There's stuff about how to get more healthy. There's like Matt Baker on the farm, which is super popular, and Johnny Vegas goes glamping. That's what audiences want right now. So there's a whole theme there about thinking faster about how people feel. And then we've been experimenting with stuff that's lower tariff, and we've definitely learned some lessons from that. But it doesn't mean that higher tariff's going away. But there'll always be a blend because we learned some good stuff.
But just to be clear on the first part of your answer there, I'm taking from that Ian and his content team are thinking, can we tap into the public mood and get ideas on screen quicker?
Yeah. Because also
than a traditional, lots of iterations of the develop, lots of treatment, commissioning, but wait for the money to come through from business affairs, go into a shoot that might be a 7, 8, 9 week shoot. There's a sense that things can speed up and be effective.
The good parts of the feedback we got were we were making decisions faster. Right, so that's something we need to take to heart, and it's something that we have wanted to change. So we've got to keep doing that. There were definitely lessons from doing stuff in rounds. We're not moving to commissioning by rounds, but when we did like the contestable fund, the global format fund, we found that created a concentration mechanism. So I think there's work for us to do to be much more specific about what we need and what slots we need it for, so that people can pitch in with more focus and get an answer quicker, because we know that's a problem for indies.
Good, okay. We're going to change tack slightly now and talk a little bit about the working culture in television. It's something that's been in the headlines recently in film and TV for obvious reasons. it strikes me that there is a disconnect between the powerful organisations in the screen industries, the PSBs, Sky, the other big broadcasters, all through media, the super indie groups, and the true indies, whereby the people that run those organisations and those organisations themselves have certain values that they would hold very dear and that they would say are absolutely integral to the values of these organisations. But it feels like there's a little bit of a gap because that isn't always being translated into the way that people experience working on television production. So I guess I'm asking, how much of a challenge is that? Alex, I'm going to come to you and I'll put the same question to you, Jen, if I may. How much of a challenge is that? How can Channel 4 ensure that the content that's being made for Channel 4 is being made under the right conditions?
Well, you're raising the right point, right? These are the issues in our industry right now, right? What's happening on sexual harassment, what's happening on bullying. And I think both of us would say we have a zero tolerance approach to that. Not to speak for you, but I'm sure you would. The question is, how do you know it's happening? And how do you fix it when you do know? And we have an industry where there's a lot of power from senior people on or off screen, on set. And we have an industry which is largely staffed by freelancers, who are the backbone of our industry. And if you are a freelancer, you are often worried, rightly, about getting your next job. And that you are worried that if you speak up, you might have a massive problem. So we have a situation on sets where this can easily go under the radar because of that power imbalance. So the onus is on us to make sure it doesn't. I mean, the big things that we've done in the past years, obviously, we've made announcements about areas where we've taken a judgment on. But the biggest thing I think we've done is have a whistleblowing line and make sure that that whistleblowing facility is on every call sheet, on every production, and pay attention to what we get in. That's one mechanism. I think we have to continue to come up with other mechanisms all the time to give people the chance to report it in a protected way. And sometimes we get reports in a protected way and we can't use those testimonies. We understand why and we still try and act. But that's a really important thing to fix in our industry.
Yeah. Jane, this is a challenge for people, right? For the industry that we need to confront, because we don't want to have a situation where we have scandal after scandal after scandal.
No, and people, well, more to the point, people need to feel safe. I mean, they shouldn't feel fearful. I mean, some of the stuff, Muriel Beale, who is working, in fact, did a really good podcast, I thought, the other day with Broadcast, is working on, and she's written her open letter. She's absolutely right. I mean, it's quite shocking things about, some of the work she'd done looking into that before she wrote the letter. Poor person who'd said they'd rather, I think, throw themselves in front of a bus, I think they said, than come to work just so they had an excuse not to come to work. And you thought, oh, God, I mean, that's just terrifying to think that someone got to that stage. So I think everything Alex has said completely, exactly the same stuff, whistleblowing, feeling that you are safe to raise issues is as much as anything. And that all comes, doesn't it, from leadership, example, all of the instances where people have felt that they've been able to come forward, they don't then suffer some negative repercussion, because that, let's face it, is a lot of the problem in the past. So all of the things you'd expect, we're doing exactly the same things. We're working with the broadcasters, that's the other point, trying very hard to make sure that we identify issues or areas where we can improve. We absolutely acknowledge we need to improve, and we're working very hard to do it. So I don't think I would say anything different from Alex, other than, we've got exactly the same freelance population of people and want them to come and want to work with us, and then support them and make sure that they want to stay and do the next gig with us. So hopefully there's also a commercial imperative to getting it right, which I think is always helpful when you're talking about business. We've got a good old commercial economic reason to have people feel happy and do their best work. People who are unhappy and want to leave are not a good thing for business either. That's not the only reason, but that is helpful.
Yeah, of course. I mean, is it the case we have a hierarchical industry? Talent is at the heart of content, and on-screen talent can be handled with kid gloves and sort of pandered to and pampered, and also powerful executives as well, the people that are behind successful shows. It's easy to have a situation where their power starts to sort of morph beyond what might be acceptable. I don't know, Jane. How widespread do you think this problem is? It's been naive. It's been shocking to me reading the Beck 2 letter, reading that kind of stuff, that you think that this, if it does feel like it's kind of commonplace. That's not an All3 Media thing. That's every production company. It's not a Channel 4 thing. It's every broadcaster. It feels like we're at not a great moment, and we need some collective action.
Well, certainly from some of the stats, from the research that's been done, it is too widespread is the answer. I don't know how widespread. It is too widespread is all you need to say. And we need to improve. There's no doubt about that. Is it about power? Yes, but that I'm sure holds true in many sectors. I don't think that's uniquely an issue in television, and that shouldn't be an excuse, frankly. If anything, the opposite. We are a talent business. So we should be nice to the people and make them feel like they can do their best work safely. So I think, look, you'll get nothing but a fairly intolerant response from both of us about this, as in we have to do something about it and we can't accept that that it is the norm. Far from it. I feel very strongly about it personally. I'm sure Alex does, and I really can speak for you. I know you well enough to know that we both do. And I think some of it comes from the top as well. You know, you have to show and demonstrate that everything you stand for isn't that, and that is not acceptable in a place where you are in a position where you can make change happen.
And this, in some ways, you talked about freelancers. I mean, all three really looked after freelancers during the pandemic. You furloughed freelancers at your, cost funded by yourself rather than the government. So, it's evident that your business is looking after freelancers. But it's interesting that this is about a kind of commitment to freelancers, particularly when cash is tight, right? When it's a busy shoot, time is tight. There are challenges that making sure that people who work as freelancers feel as though they can, or they don't need to suffer inappropriate, unacceptable behaviour.
Yeah, you're right. It's important. And they are important, extremely important. Yeah.
Well, there was a whole thing about the pandemic, wasn't there, when it became so apparent the pros and cons of being a freelancer, right? So all of us contributing, we made a big contribution to the freelance fund, and we were in better state. We tried to support freelancers with a lot of training that Charlotte Black and her team did during the period when there wasn't work. But I think thinking as an industry what more we can do to support is something we've all come through the pandemic realising, because it wasn't so apparent until it suddenly was.
Yeah. I think that's right. And I think
really tricky times.
And I think we're both probably working on that sort of, it isn't easy this, but trying to make the freelance community feel like more of a community. So we've launched a thing called Workplace, which is a Facebook product, which is about tying together the group from a communication perspective. And we'd very much like freelance people to use that as well. So there's a sense then of belonging, not necessarily literally, because they are still freelance, but they've got a place they can go for support, and a sense of being a part of a community of people, even if it's looser than a straightforward employment contract. Because actually, at the end of the day, it shouldn't really be defined by employment contract, should it? You should feel part of something, and as part of something, you should be able to communicate and talk and share and be supported. I think probably that's where we all want to try and get to. The model of your employment status really is actually ultimately less relevant.
Very good. Another area, Alex, where the industry has become clear through the release of data in recent times, where the industry needs to make progress, is around disability. Been a big move towards a big push on diversity. It does feel a little bit as though potentially disability is being left behind in that diversity debate. I wonder what your view on that would be.
Well, we're in a Paralympics year, so it's a big year for us. But I think I hope, fingers crossed with what's going to happen in Japan. But I think your point is right, Chris. Disability has been left behind. Disability isn't talked about enough, and it has now become a real problem in our industry. So if you look at the latest stats for Diamond, you have to remember the UK is 17% people with disabled people, and now the latest stats are saying it's 5.8% in our industry off screen. Channel 4, we're 10%. We've set ourselves a 12% target. So first of all, if you look at the evidence, we're doing woefully. Then if you look at the anecdotal, it's not good. So if you talk to disabled freelancers or producers or people in our industry, they will cite many, many examples of their rights not being adhered to. And this is very much about rights. It's not about charity. And if you talk to indies, I think the will is there, but the knowledge isn't necessarily. So they often do things which are quite ableist. So our job at Channel 4 is to help change it. You know, we are the change maker in this stuff, and we're meant to be the first in the industry to do it. So we've just hired a new disability lead in our creative diversity team, Ali Castle. She's doing a brilliant job of thinking, how can we make an impact on this year? Because it feels like it's now got to a point in the industry where we're really far behind, and we're not doing enough for really talented people who are in our industry and are ready for work. So some of that is about helping the indie community, right? Our job should be, how can we help make people aware? How can we help do the education? How can we help make our industry more inclusive? Then it's obviously about changing things on screen, where we're in a good position, but there's still more we can do. And then the third thing is about listening to the audience, like what they want. You know, 17% is a big chunk of our audience, and are we doing enough to satisfy what they want to see in terms of representation on screen?
Do you think that some of the adaptations through COVID and how fast we were able to change shows us that we can change quite fast if we have the right impetus? I don't know, I'd like to think that. When we were keen to do more, but we're probably, I don't know what our all three stats are. I know what the sector stats are. I suspect our all three stats follow the sector stats. Why wouldn't they? But do you think, Alex, that that COVID, and we've learned that we can adapt fast to different things? Do you think we could learn to adapt to be more open?
I think we could, completely. And I think also what happened with Black Lives Matter showed us how fast we can create interventions in the industry. But there's, you know, and it's my job to help with it, there's a lack of knowledge. So there's a lack of knowledge about apparent disability and non-apparent disability. There's a lack of knowledge about how you can adapt roles or office setups to make them possible for people. So there's a set of assumptions about wheelchair accessibility, and that's about where people stop thinking about it. So there's a job for us to do on that. I think we could completely make the changes required, but it does require quite a broader conversation and articles in your lovely publications, etc. There's a huge group of people working in the industry who've got thoughts, who've been through this all before, but we need to give them a platform and a voice and sort of all commit to how we're going to make those changes.
It feels like there's some momentum at the moment. CDN are doing lots of work around disability, and I know it's a focus for lots of organisations.
And people have rights, right? They have rights to like go and get jobs and work, and that's important to think about as well. This is not like a favour. It's not charity. It's about thinking about where are there skills in our industry which we're not accessing.
Very good. Let's move on and let's talk sort of strategy at the moment. Jane, Alex and Channel 4 in recent months have been articulating their new digital-first strategy. You know, that performance on all four is now the key sort of barometer of success. As a boss of a production group, when you hear that, does that impact the way in which you intend to try and supply programs to Alex? Or is it just that you need to make fantastic shows, and whether they premiere on all four or are box setted or go out linear, it doesn't really factor into your thinking?
Well, I think it does factor into the thinking, yeah. I mean, any conversation you have with a commissioning team, you know, the questions you're discussing are all around editorial, but then they're all around the way that the consumer will consume the content, the economics of it, whatever it might be. So definitely, and we want to be part of that. We want to be part of the helping of the, you know, the transition or responding to the consumer demand in the way that people's behaviour has changed in the way they view programmes. We want to be part of that. So we want to be very much hand in glove with the commissioning team, making the show that works on whichever platform. We don't think digital, non-digital, if that's part of your question. We don't sit there and distinguish between those two things. For us, everything is digital, and for us, everything is being viewed across multiple platforms, multiple geographies, all times of day, on demand or on linear. So actually, we've got way beyond thinking this is a linear thing that might be watched on catch-up, ooh, who knew, to something which could be viewed in any number of ways. And tech is ubiquitous, and we all know that stuff now. So I think we don't narrowly look at it in the way maybe you described, but we certainly talk to these guys about how do you see this content being consumed, and we want to be part of it.
Setting them within that as an idea that...
But we don't even call them box sets anymore, Chris. I mean, I don't know, maybe you do in Channel 4. We don't sit there and say, ooh, it's a box set. Some of our dramas go out, you know, as a stack, and others go out on a strip across a week, and others go out on a weekly... I mean, look at Line of Duty, you know, it's not ours, sadly, but it goes out on a weekly show, and my God, it was talked about telly as a result. So we're used to all models. I mean, one of the themes is the world has become much more complicated, but that's a positive if you're a competent producer of content. So your stuff is going out, the consumer is viewing it in so many different ways. It's a broad topic, but we absolutely will work with these guys to every time, I think, case by case.
I think you've got to look at it like now, release patterns. So with movies, you always had release patterns, like you released before Christmas or you released at Easter, you had it on this many screens in this geography for this long, you had it available
Yeah, you windowed it all over the place.
Pay-per-view.
Yeah.
That's how you thought about it, right? And different kinds of movies had different release patterns, right, depending on who the audience demo was. Now I think we need to think about it like that. Some things will be released on a week by week. Some things may be pre-released everything available on streaming only. Some things you may, in the old language box set, which comes from having, remember when we had to get DVDs and put them in the machine? So we'll have a set of release patterns, and it will depend on how we think we can best market the show and how the audience might want to watch the show. So I want to see Line of Duty. We shouldn't talk about a competitor show, should we? Weekly,
Popular,
right?
so
That's what we want to see. Other things, I want to gun it all. So we've got to think about it like that, and how do you optimize the marketing? Whereas the old way was, what's it up against at 8 p.m. on a Tuesday? And that determined everything. So it's a massive switch for organizations like us. It's much easier for Netflix because it's all
But it's much easier for a producer, because fun enough, when we look at the development slates, we never say, this one is designed so that it goes out on a scheduled weekly transmission basis. And this one, on the other hand, is going to be a little box set number. In a million years, you don't do that. You're looking at the quality of the idea, the writer, the talent, the director, whatever you're looking at. But you're certainly not looking at it as, how do we see this thing being released to the public? You're just looking at it based on its merits as a project.
But it does mean we've got lots of work to do to go, what does good look like in terms of numbers? So we're doing work now on, what data can we give a producer on a week by week basis that says, here's what the live was, here's what the streaming was, here's our benchmark.
Yeah.
Because we need to provide that so people can also go, what should they be judging against? Because, the old way is till 9:36 in the morning, look at the overnights. And we've got to train ourselves out of all of that. And in this phase where we're doing this change, we've got to provide more data. So we'll be doing that over the coming months. Of like, what do we give
Sharing
Jane's
different data
teams?
with
Sharing
producers.
different data. This is our benchmark.
Yeah.
This is what the show did. Because that's not really available. It's not easy for producers to get.
Yeah.
So we need to kind of open up a bit more to do that.
And direction of travel, Alex, I mean, you talked about the different release models, but I also took from the Future Force strategy statement that the direction of travel is pretty clear, that a far greater proportion of Channel 4 output, I don't know, come the start of 2022, for example, I don't know, what proportion do you think of Channel 4's programming where would have every episode available at the point of first TX?
Like, at the moment, we're about 20% of our total viewing is streaming, right? We're aiming for now that to get to 30%. If we grow faster, great. This year, we'll have about 70 titles that are all EPs released at once, right? That's a big shift from where we were. I generally do not find any resistance at all from producers. Producers want their stuff to be watched. And generally, they go, if that's how it's going to get more watched, great. And that's how we all consume personally. So we're all used to it. Then, the question is, which shows doesn't that work for? You wouldn't want the competitive reveal on Bake Off to be like that, right? You wouldn't want that. But for Ackley Bridge, for like a young demographic, it worked really well. It's never going to work for Hollyoaks because it's a continuing soap, right? The whole point is to tune in at the same time every day. So there's always going to be a balance.
For closed episode, Midsummer Murders. So they are all different, but as a producer, that is a conversation you have with the broadcast. It's not back in development times.
Yeah. It's not when you're developing the idea.
No.
Okay, that makes sense.
But we are in a phase where like so much has to change because we're shifting businesses. That's hard because it's a lot of kind of discussion. What does this mean? How will it change?
And we're
How do we
promiscuous,
judge ourselves?
which is part of the issue for the platforms that are changing. We are very promiscuous. We will sell our programs to the people who buy them. And that is everybody, from Netflix all the way through.
So on that basis, Jane, I'm going to ask you to imagine that Alex isn't here. What about your, for all three, your number one customers, your priorities?
Well, Alex is my number one customer.
She just said she's promiscuous.
Yes, she is, but Netflix is up in the top 4. If you'd looked at all three media 5 years ago, the biggest slice of the pie by a long shot would have been Channel 4. We're much broader now in terms of our coverage of different platforms. And that's a positive. It really is. It's a positive for us. It's much more cash coming into the system. No producer, I think, would refute that. I think it makes for a better and more creative environment when you have a greater number of different platforms to sell to. And that we have loved, because in the nicest possible way, and Alex is here, but I will say it, the amount the PSBs are spending on content is not going up, can't go up, I think, in the short term. And so we've relied very heavily on the money coming in from the new entrants, and it's been fantastic. I would say that because we're sitting there enjoying making programmes for them.
Very good. Jane, you've helpfully segued us. Before meeting up today, I asked you both to think about a question for one another. And I think, Jane, your question for Alex kind of follows on from that point a little bit.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting sort of theme, which maybe is a theme for a future broadcast event, around the sort of Britishness versus the global nature of platforms, content consumption, whichever audience actually. And I say that, I guess, Alex, because, you know, we've got Little Dot, for example, based in East London. Loads of young people, hundreds of young people now working there, uploading content that's being viewed. People who've probably never been to the States, in some cases, young, you know, guys and girls, uploading content that's being viewed in America. A lot of it, over 50, probably 60% being viewed in the States. That's a world with no respect for jurisdiction. It's just global. It's global content. It's available everywhere to everyone. Versus maybe a Channel 4 show that goes out on, you know, at 6 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon or evening, which will be designed, commissioned, you know, thought about as a piece of content for the British viewer. And I just think that whole global British thing is fascinating and is sort of a good thing for you, but is also a challenge for you. How do you as a British PSB, a strong British PSB, respond to the global nature of this new multi-platform world?
So we did a big piece of research last year because I was fascinated by the question of, okay, we're doing really well and people are watching. Why? And what are they getting emotionally from Netflix or Amazon when they watch? And what are they getting from public service broadcasting? And if you sort of summarize the massive piece of research, people see what they get from us as Britain looking at the world from the inside out. So looking at things, not parochial, not like all about being British, but we're looking at the world. Gogglebox, one of your shows, great example of this, right? You know, it's talking about everything, but it's looking at it as British people. But the SVODs are looking at things from the outside in. Everyone's looking in at Tiger King. But, you know, you don't have to have a point of view before you watch it. Any nationality could be examining that thing. And consumers see those as two very different things. One is about us looking outwards from a British perspective. And obviously, those shows, you can see the complete differences between them. But it's not about being parochial in British content. It's not about being nationalistic, but it's about the perspective and the starting place that takes you from. So you also have more relatable characters in it. But you can do that and the show work incredibly well internationally.
Yeah.
So, you know, Dairy Girls, Dairy Girls works really well on Netflix internationally. So I also don't see that it's a blocker, British-made content, in that case about being British, working abroad. And we know that many formats have come from this country that work in lots and lots of countries. But I do think it's something that we have to take into account when we think of the distinctiveness that consumers expect from us. So it does mean we can have things that work abroad, but it means that there are things that when we make them, and I won't name any shows here, but we've done them before as big co-pros, you know, they haven't been Europuddings, but they have had that sense of no particular rootedness in a British perspective.
I think the sense of belonging is part of the answer, isn't it? Yeah, whether it's country belonging or, you know, cohort or community or whatever, I totally agree.
And viewers recognise that.
Yeah.
So it means that we always have to ask a question, we could go in on that production, but does it feel like us? And even when you look at our acquisitions, like Handmaid's Tale or Fargo, there's a sort of, they chime with a British sensibility.
They feel like they're at home. They do, actually.
Even though they're not our shows, they're acquisitions. So we've got to have that clear in our taste palette. And it also means sharpening the brand for what feels Channel 4, because people need to see why it would come from us in a crowded landscape.
And do you feel frustrated that you don't have your LA office and your global footprint and your whole world domination plan up your sleeve?
I think there's a fundamental piece of being Channel 4, which is about building the indie community and creative exports. And if you pull that apart, you're not Channel 4 anymore. So, the terms of trade, which give that to indies, as you and I know both well, if you remove that, maybe you're not Channel 4 building the UK creative economy that exports out. However, I do think there are ways we can work better together. So, we just did this global format fund. Yeah. What are the ideas where we can take more risk by commissioning to 2 series? Indies can be more invested in that risk by giving up a bit. Yeah. But we try harder to work together to create something that can export.
I think you can do even more, actually. I think if you properly harness the creative community in the UK and get their commercially creative brains into the funding of some of that content, I think you can take that even to the next step. And I think the fact that you aren't the in-house producer model is helpful. That's interesting.
So I think what are the ways we can do that more together, which means both taking a bit more risk, but as a partnership, that's interesting.
Yeah.
And strategically, Alex, that's important for Channel 4 going forward in terms of modifying that relationship with not for all projects, obviously, but for certain projects, modifying that relationship with the indie community and just coming at it from a slightly different perspective for projects of scale we're talking about.
Yeah, for projects that have got export potential, global potential, because I think there's a question there, could we both do better from that? I'm not suggesting ripping up the terms of trade, but where are there projects where we could both do better, where the indie and the broadcaster is up for it?
It's utterly consensual, this, and mutually beneficial, to be honest, Chris, if it works.
That's always worth asking, because indies, but super global mega indies or whatever you are now, want shows that can be exported worldwide. That's what the model's built on. So where are there opportunities is worth talking about.
So, there was always this old narrative of the powerful broadcasters and the production companies begging for scraps from the table. Then that narrative becomes, now it's the super indie groups. They're all part of global corporate entities which dwarf the British PSBs. The reality is that somewhere in between, right? That this relationship
it's neither of those two extremes. But come on, let's face it, 80% whatever of original commissioning still comes from the PSBs in the UK. So we are still massively supplicant and massively reliant on commissioning decisions made by Alex and her team, BBC, ITV, Channel 5. You know that. You know the numbers, and we have no issue with that. It was always thus. We actually enjoy the relationship. But we still need to sell. We're still sellers and they're still the buyers. So, at the end of the day, I think the power, you mentioned the power shift. The power shift, I think, has gone to the consumer. If you really want to analyse where power has moved, it's moved to the consumer. We've now got, the best consumer proposition I think any viewer of any content has ever had in the world. The choice is off the scale. They can watch it on any device, relatively cost effectively, whenever, wherever, in whatever format. I've never known that in my life. You don't have to remember to actually pitch up when the scheduler says you do anymore. Far from it. We haven't been there for a long time.
Well, the real problem is how do you make things stand out?
Yeah.
Right? Consumers have got more choice than ever before.
Choice is unbelievable.
And they are overwhelmed by choice. And when we do research, consumers are overwhelmed. This leads to a dichotomy of choice where they can't make a choice and they fear commitment to something in case they get the wrong thing. So they revert to the familiar. So that's why you get Friends being sold and resold and resold. And you get more episodes of things that work, but at the same time, we all want new things. Consumers want new things too, but then we have to work harder to make those new things cut through and market. And I think we're going to be in that phase for a long time. There's too much choice. Big things get bigger. Fresh, new things are harder to land, but we all want them. And that's a hard job.
That's another interesting theme. It's great for the consumer, but it is not an easy place for either consumer or supplier.
Well, it's good to hear that Channel 4 wants new things for Jane. I'm sure
from all three media.
I'm sure that Jane will be determined to supply Channel 4 with
she is very determined.
Plenty of new things. So thank you very much for your time today, and we really appreciate you coming together to kick around a few of those interesting ideas. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Pleasure.